Hey, everybody. Welcome back to the CannaTech podcast. I am with Sterling Stoudenmire. How you doing, Sterling?
Doing well. How are you?
Good, good. I'm really looking forward to this podcast because KPIs are near and dear to my heart. We'll get to that in a moment. But first, a little bit about you. You have a diverse professional background in finance. How did you get into cannabis?
I began my career at what is now Accenture Consulting and did work for, Global 1000 companies, really kind of all over the world. Spent some time in Europe and a little bit in South America. Um, that was a lot of focus on, systems and IT, but my degree was in finance. And so I was like kind of always looking at how do we apply finance or how do we apply systems to finance to get better at it. And that was a big part of my quest. I also spent some time doing human performance work, which is around, how do we maximize performance of the workforce and at the same time improve, their overall job satisfaction and compensation. And that all comes down to productivity. So that starts leading us towards KPIs.
Yep.
But I started out basically when I left Accenture, I went into a turnaround business. So I did turnarounds for a while in the timeshare industry, a lot of real estate work, and then finished a hotel franchisor turnaround. And some of the private equity guys I was working with asked me to move to Salina, Colorado, and I was like, "Go where?" and they said, "Well, it's kind of in the middle of the state." And I said, "Okay, why?" And they're like, "We're getting in the weed business." So I was like, "We're doing what?" So, I was kind of starting at square zero, but I grew up going to a farm every summer with my family and, working on a farm. So I was pretty comfortable around the concept of agriculture and horticulture. And was sent there basically to build this from the ground up. And that's what we did over the course of 7 years and built a 100,000 square foot greenhouse cannabis cultivation facility with a large scale extraction facility. We had 6 different brands and 6 dispensaries when I departed. Plus we distributed to another 150 or so around the state. So
Yeah.
we approached it differently than most, though, and that was kind of the story of getting to the KPIs because we looked at this as process manufacturing, and so as a result, there were a number of sort of ready off the shelf things we could use, but we also did invent a few along the way.
Yep. Well, what is cannabis modus? I like the name of that. What is it?
Well, I never took Latin, but I'm always fascinated with the roots and etymology of words, and so modus is it has a variety of meanings in Latin, but one of them is measurement. And so the whole idea is how do we measure cannabis and how do we do that in a consistent fashion? And so I created a Substack article that or site called Cannabis Modus. And my goal is to just continuously sort of publish things that we learn and see in the cannabis KPI world, get feedback from people, and ultimately sort of crowdsource being the more modern term, but really socialize this and get input from other parties and get best practices from other parties and try to establish a baseline ultimately of, what should the expectations be? What should yield be? What should be, financial ratios, retail ratios, et cetera. But that's the real problem right now is that we've progressed as an industry, I think, a little bit beyond having no KPIs to having some. But our 2 biggest challenges right now are, one, there's no consistency in the way they're calculated. So, when people say, a particular KPI, they might mean something entirely different than what you're thinking. And then the other is, without that consistency, we also don't have any benchmarks to say, well, this is where your yield should be, or this is where your energy cost should be, or this is, those kinds of things. So you can compare and understand, how much further do you have to go or how much, better can you be than your competitors.
Yep. Well, you probably answered my next question, but I still want to ask it as, you're the first I've seen talk about KPIs in the cannabis segment as I track the segment. I think you've already answered it about what got you here. And it sounds like you were just bringing your traditional background and applying it to cannabis. Is that fair?
Yes. And I think that that lens of looking at it as, process manufacturing versus looking at it as, loving the plant or looking at it as, wow, it's really cool. I can make a living in the cannabis industry. Those weren't my motivations. My motivation was to be as efficient as possible because at the end of the day, I'm responsible for the investor's capital and I'm responsible for getting the return on that capital. And in the early days of the industry, I see this changing now, but in the early days of the industry, I characterize the industry as being a lot of smart money chasing a lot of dumb players. And by that, I mean that, we had investors who had a lot of capital, had a lot of business experience and expertise, and, had a lot of success in investing in companies, but they didn't have the knowledge of the cannabis industry. And again, there were no baselines, there were no benchmarks because the industry was all underground, right? So none of that was really published. To the extent that it wasn't consistent. And, there's a lot of, joking around about, well, this guy went to Gold University, and that's how he learned this. So, how do we establish those things as an industry? And so I use, manufacturing as sort of a baseline to say, okay, what are the sort of common KPIs there, and financial services and, financial management of the firm. So all those things kind of came together in that. And, I worked my way through college tutoring accounting and finance. So I'd spent a lot of time around these ratios, from an accounting, finance, manufacturing standpoint, and doing implementations of ERP platforms and things. That's an essential component. I mean, it's why you put these things in so that you can manage the process and get the results and understand, what's going on. And I was really kind of floored in the early days of the industry that people weren't even tracking the basic things that you would need to be able to get to a KPI at all, right? And so now I think we're getting to the point where people are tracking those things, but then understanding, okay, well, how do I interpret that? And what do I, and that comes down to applying a KPI. And then ultimately, okay, how do I evaluate that KPI and what actions do I take and what levers are available for me to improve my efficiency?
Yep. Maybe one or two more examples of the KPIs that you measure. And what I'm getting at is, back in my traditional life of IT infrastructure, I could tell you trouble tickets, right? How many trouble tickets and how quickly did we resolve them? What are two examples, please?
Well, I think the first one is probably the base yield example, which is a really interesting one because in the underground days, it tended to be really kind of meaningless metrics. So the way I look at it is grams per canopy square foot, and there's a couple of reasons for that. Most KPIs involve, doing some math and dividing, some set of numbers by some other numbers to come up with a ratio.
Right.
And what I learned over the years is that, if the denominator in that equation isn't stable, in other words, it can be gamed, the ratio is pretty worthless. And so in the early days of yield, the two big ones I always heard were pounds per light and, grams per watt. And so effectively kind of trying to measure the same thing. The grams per watt is probably a more accurate measure because it at least takes into account the wattage of the light. But pounds per light was sort of the worst one, really meaningless because it all came down to, well, what was the cycle time? Did you flower for 10 weeks or 12 weeks or 14 weeks, or 8 weeks or whatever? How much square footage in terms of the canopy was that light covering? How many watts did that light have? And, all those things were fungible. And so therefore the metric didn't really mean much. Grams per watt was a little better in that, you at least are saying, this is how many watts of light I had, and how many grams I got. But again, it ignores cycle time. It ignores, area, right? Square footage area. So the whole idea of grams per canopy square foot is to say, let's just look at how many grams of product did you get out of a square foot of a canopy, meaning, the space on the bench where the plants are. And on a consistent cycle time. So, every whatever days, every 56 days if you're an 8-week cycle, et cetera. And that way you at least have a baseline that's consistent. So to me, that's sort of like the base KPI for everything, because if you can improve that, everything gets better.
Well, finally, do you only do KPIs at the grow and production levels? I think I'm hearing that, or do you drop down to the retail level?
In the retail space, the good news is the hard part about cultivation is there are some agricultural KPIs and things, but a lot of it is very specific to cannabis. If you get into retail, retail is retail, and it's all over the world. I've worked with retailers in Europe and all over North America, and it comes down to a set of measures that pretty much every retailer has, right? Everything from what the industry likes to call GMROL, gross margin return on labor dollars or on labor hours, or your customer retention rate, your average basket size, your inventory turns. Those are all standards. But I also look at financial ratios and operating ratios, right? So current ratio, quick ratio, those kinds of things. Because at the end of the day, we're a business and we're responsible for getting a return on the invested capital.
Yep. Yep. Well, hey, I want to thank you, and let's stay in touch. Let's continue the conversation.
Absolutely. And check out the Substack. I'll keep adding things to it, and I welcome anybody's feedback.
Yep. And what is your URL to go see your work?
I believe it's cannabismodus.substack.com.
Okay, great. We'll put it down in the blog below. Thank you, Sterling.
All right.